Harper Audio presents The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, performed by Frances McDormand. It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. I'm stupid about executions. The idea of being electrocuted makes me sick, and that's all there was to read about in the papers. Goggle-eyed headlines staring up at me on every street corner and at the fusty, peanut-smelling mouth of every subway. It had nothing to do with me, but I couldn't help wondering what it would be like, being burned alive all along your nerves. I thought it must be the worst thing in the world. I knew something was wrong with me because all I could think about was the Rosenbergs and how stupid I'd been to buy all those uncomfortable, expensive clothes hanging limp as fish in my closet, and how all the little successes I'd totted up so happily at college fizzled to nothing outside the slick marble and plate glass fronts along Madison Avenue. I was supposed to be having the time of my life. I was supposed to be the envy of thousands of other college girls just like me all over America who wanted nothing more than to be tripping about in those same size 7 patent leather shoes I'd bought in Bloomingdale's one lunch hour, with a black patent leather belt and black patent leather pocketbook to match. And when my picture came out in the magazine that 12 of us were working on, drinking martinis in a skimpy imitation silver lame bodice stuck onto a big fat cloud of white tulle on some starlight roof, in the company of several anonymous young men with all-American bone structures hired or loaned for the occasion, everybody would think I must be having a real whirl. Look what can happen in this country, they'd say. A girl lives in some out-of-the-way town for 19 years, so poor she can't afford a magazine, and then she gets a scholarship to college and wins a prize here and a prize there and ends up steering New York like her own private car. Only I wasn't steering anything, not even myself. I just bumped from my hotel to work, and to parties, and from parties to my hotel, and back to work like a numb trolley bus. I guess I should have been excited the way most of the other girls were, but I couldn't get myself to react. I felt very still and very empty, the way the eye of a tornado must feel, moving dully along in the middle of the surrounding hullabaloo. There were 12 of us at the hotel. We'd all won a fashion magazine contest by writing essays and stories and poems and fashion blurbs, and as prizes they gave us jobs in New York for a month, expenses paid, and piles of free bonuses, like ballet tickets and passes to fashion shows, and hairstylings at a famous expensive salon, and chances to meet successful people in the field of our desire, and advice about what to do with our particular complexions. I got such a kick out of all those free gifts showering onto us. For a long time afterwards, I hid them away, but later, when I was all right again, I brought them out, and I still have them around the house. I use the lipsticks now and then, and last week I cut the plastic starfish off the sunglasses case for the baby to play with. This hotel, the Amazon, was for women only, and they were mostly girls my age with wealthy parents who wanted to be sure their daughters would be living where men couldn't get at them and deceive them. And they were all going to posh secretarial schools like Katie Gibbs, where they had to wear hats and stockings and gloves to class. Or they had just graduated from places like Katie Gibbs and were secretaries to executives and junior executives and simply hanging around in New York, waiting to get married to some career man or other. These girls looked awfully bored to me. I saw them on the sunroof, yawning and painting their nails, and trying to keep up their Bermuda tans, and they seemed bored as hell. Girls like that make me sick. I'm so jealous I can't speak. 19 years, and I hadn't been out of New England except for this trip to New York. It was my first big chance, but here I was, sitting back and letting it run through my fingers like so much water. I guess one of my troubles was Doreen. I'd never known a girl like Doreen before. Doreen came from a society girls' college down south and had bright white hair standing out in a cotton candy fluff round her head and blue eyes like transparent agate marbles, hard and polished and just about indestructible, and a mouth set in a sort of perpetual sneer. I don't mean a nasty sneer, but an amused, mysterious sneer. Doreen singled me out right away. She made me feel I was that much sharper than the others, and she really was wonderfully funny. She used to sit next to me at the conference table, and when the visiting celebrities were talking, she'd whisper witty, sarcastic remarks to me under her breath. The only thing Doreen ever bawled me out about was bothering to get my assignments in by a deadline. "What are you sweating over that for? You know old J.C. won't give a damn if that story's in tomorrow or Monday. J.C.'s ugly as sin," Doreen went on coolly. "I bet that old husband of hers turns out all the lights before he gets near her, or he'd puke otherwise." J.C. was my boss, and I liked her a lot, in spite of what Doreen said. She wasn't one of the fashion magazine gushers with fake eyelashes and giddy jewelry. J.C. had brains, so her plug-ugly looks didn't seem to matter. J.C. wanted to teach me something. All the old ladies I ever knew wanted to teach me something, but I suddenly didn't think they had anything to teach me. We were stuck in the theater hour rush, and nothing moved. Doreen looked terrific. She was wearing a strapless white lace dress zipped up over a snug corset affair that curved her in at the middle and bulged her out again spectacularly above and below, and she smelled strong as a whole perfume store. I wore a black shantung sheath that cost me $40. It was part of a buying spree I had with some of my scholarship money when I heard I was one of the lucky ones going to New York. This dress was cut so queerly I couldn't wear any sort of bra under it, but that didn't matter much as I was skinny as a boy and barely rippled, and I liked feeling almost naked on the hot summer nights. When the man in the blue lumber shirt and black chinos and tooled leather cowboy boots started to stroll over to us, I didn't have any illusions. I knew perfectly well he'd come for Doreen. He threaded his way out between the stopped cars and leaned engagingly on the sill of our open window. "And what, may I ask, are two nice girls like you doing all alone in a cab on a nice night like this?" He had a big, wide, white toothpaste-ad smile. "We're on our way to a party," I blurted, since Doreen had gone suddenly dumb as a post and was fiddling in a blasé way with her white lace pocketbook cover. "That sounds boring," the man said. "Why don't you both join me for a couple of drinks? I have some friends waiting as well." I knew that if I sat tight, in 2 seconds I'd be wishing I'd taken this gift of a chance to see something of New York besides what the people on the magazine had planned out for us so carefully. "How about it, Doreen?" I said. "Well, all right," Doreen said to me. I opened the door and we stepped out of the cab just as it was edging ahead again and started to walk over to the bar. "Come on, Frankie," the man said to one of his friends, and a short, scrunty fellow detached himself and came into the bar with us. He was the type of fellow I can't stand. I'm 5'10" in my stocking feet, and when I'm with little men, I stoop over a bit and slouch my hips, one up and one down, so I'll look shorter, and I feel gawky and morbid as somebody in a sideshow. It was so dark in the bar I could hardly make out anything except Doreen. I felt myself melting into the shadows like the negative of a person I'd never seen before in my life. "Well, what do we have?" the man asked with a large smile. "I think I'll have an old-fashioned," Doreen said to me. Ordering drinks always floored me. I didn't know whiskey from gin, and never managed to get anything I really liked the taste of. Buddy Willard and the other college boys I knew were usually too poor to buy hard liquor, or they scorned drinking altogether. It's amazing how many college boys don't drink or smoke. I seem to know them all. "I'll have a vodka," I said. The man looked at me more closely. "With anything?" "Just plain," I said. "I always have it plain." Thought I might make a fool of myself by saying I'd have it with ice or soda or gin or anything. I'd seen a vodka ad once, just a glass full of vodka, standing in the middle of a snowdrift in a blue light, and the vodka looked clear and pure as water, so I thought having vodka playing must be all right. Doreen wasn't saying a word. She only toyed with her cork placemat and eventually lit a cigarette. But the man didn't seem to mind. He kept staring at her the way people stare at the great white macaw in the zoo, waiting for it to say something human. "What do you do?" I asked the man, to break the silence shooting up around me on all sides, thick as jungle grass. Slowly, and with what seemed a great effort, the man dragged his eyes away from Doreen's shoulder. "I'm a disc jockey," he said. "You probably must have heard of me. Name's Lenny Shepherd." "I know you," Doreen said suddenly. "I'm glad about that, honey," the man said and burst out laughing. "That'll come in handy. I'm famous as hell." Then Lenny Shepherd gave Frankie a long look. "Say, where do you come from?" Frankie asked, sitting up with a jerk. "What's your name?" "My name's Ellie Higginbottom," I said. "I come from Chicago." After that, I felt safer. I didn't want anything I said or did that night to be associated with me and my real name and coming from Boston. "Well, Ellie, what do you say we dance some?" The thought of dancing with that little runt in his orange suede elevator shoes and mingy T-shirt and droopy blue sports coat made me laugh. If there's anything I look down on, it's a man in a blue outfit. Black or gray or brown, even. Blue just makes me laugh. "I'm not in the mood," I said coldly, turning my back on him and hitching my chair over nearer to Doreen and Lenny. Those two looked as if they'd known each other for years by now. Doreen was spooning up the hunks of fruit at the bottom of her glass with a spindly silver spoon, and Lenny was grunting each time she lifted the spoon to her mouth, and snapping and pretending to be a dog or something, and trying to get the fruit off the spoon. Doreen giggled and kept spooning up the fruit. "I better go now," Frankie said, standing up. Then I heard Doreen say, "I won't come unless Ellie comes." I had to hand it to her the way she picked out my fake name. "Mo Ellie'll come, won't you, Ellie?" Lenny said, giving me a wink. "Sure I'll come," I said. I thought I'd string along with Doreen. I wanted to see as much as I could. I liked looking on at other people in crucial situations. If there was a road accident or a street fight or a baby pickled in a laboratory jar for me to look at, I'd stop and look so hard I never forgot it. I wouldn't have missed Lenny's place for anything. It was built exactly like the inside of a ranch, only in the middle of a New York apartment house. Instead of pictures hung up on the walls, he had antlers and buffalo horns and a stuffed rabbit head. Lenny jutted a thumb at the meek little gray muzzle and stiff jackrabbit ears. "Ran over that in Las Vegas." He walked away across the room, his cowboy boots echoing like pistol shots. "Acoustics," he said, and grew smaller and smaller until he vanished through a door in the distance. All at once, music started to come out of the air on every side. Then it stopped, and we heard Lenny's voice say, "This is your 12 o'clock disc jock, Lenny Shepherd, with a roundup of the tops and pops. Number 10 in the wagon train this week is none other than that little yellow-haired gal you've been hearing so much about lately, the one and only Sunflower." "What a card," Doreen said. "Isn't he a card?" "You bet," I said. "Listen, Ellie, do me a favor." She seemed to think Ellie was who I really was by now. "Stick around, will you? I wouldn't have a chance if he tried anything funny. Did you see that muscle?" Doreen giggled. Lenny popped out of the back room, ambled over to the bar, and began to mix drinks from several different bottles. "Terrific, huh?" Lenny came over, balancing 3 glasses. He held out a hand to Doreen, and without a word, they both started to jitterbug, still hanging on to their glasses. I sat cross-legged and tried to look devout and impassive, like some businessman I once saw watching an Algerian belly dancer. The two of them didn't stop jitterbugging. I felt myself shrinking to a small black dot. Felt like a hole in the ground. There is something demoralizing about watching two people get more and more crazy about each other, especially when you're the only extra person in the room. Every so often, Lenny and Doreen would bang into each other and kiss, and then swing back to take a long drink and close in on each other again. I thought I might just lie down and go to sleep until Doreen felt ready to go back to the hotel. Then Lenny gave a terrible roar. I sat up. Doreen was hanging onto Lenny's left earlobe with her teeth. "Let go, you bitch!" Lenny stooped, and Doreen went flying up onto his shoulder, and her glass sailed out of her hand in a long, wide arc and fetched up against the pine paneling with a silly tinkle. Lenny was still roaring and whirling around so fast I couldn't see Doreen's face. I noticed, in the routine way you notice the color of somebody's eyes, that Doreen's breasts had popped out of her dress and were swinging out slightly like full brown melons as she circled belly down on Lenny's shoulder, thrashing her legs in the air and screeching. And then they both started to laugh and slow up, and Lenny was trying to bite Doreen's hip through her skirt when I let myself out the door before anything more could happen and managed to get downstairs by leaning with both hands on the banister and half sliding the whole way. I didn't know where in the world I was. Then I took my New York street map out of my pocketbook. I was exactly 43 blocks by 5 blocks away from my hotel. Walking has never fazed me. And when I walked into the lobby of the hotel, I was perfectly sober and my feet only slightly swollen. There wasn't a soul in the hall. I let myself into my room. The silence depressed me. It wasn't the silence of silence. It was my own silence. I couldn't hear a thing. The city hung in my window, flat as a poster, glittering and blinking, but it might just as well not have been there at all, for all the good it did me. The china-white bedside telephone could have connected me up with things, but there it sat, dumb as a death's head. I tried to think of people I'd given my phone number to, so I could make a list of all the possible calls I might be about to receive. But all I could think of was that I'd given my phone number to Buddy Willard's mother, so she could give it to a simultaneous interpreter she knew at the UN. I let out a small, dry laugh. I could imagine the sort of simultaneous interpreter Mrs. Willard would introduce me to when all the time she wanted me to marry Buddy, who was taking the cure for TB somewhere in upper New York State. I decided to take a hot bath. There must be quite a few things a hot bath won't cure, but I don't know many of them. Whenever I'm sad I'm going to die, or so nervous I can't sleep, or in love with somebody I won't be seen for a week, I slump down just so far, and then I say, I'll go take a hot bath. I lay in that tub on the 17th floor of this hotel for women only, high up over the jazz and push of New York, for near on to an hour, and I felt myself growing pure again. I don't believe in baptism or the waters of Jordan or anything like that, but I guess I feel about a hot bath the way those religious people feel about holy water. I said to myself, Doreen is dissolving, Lenny Shepherd is dissolving, Frankie is dissolving, New York is dissolving. They are all dissolving away, and none of them matter anymore. I don't know them, I've never known them, and I am very pure. All that liquor and the sticky kisses I saw and the dirt that settled on my skin on the way back is turning into something pure. The longer I lay there in the clear hot water, the purer I felt. And when I stepped out at last and wrapped myself in one of the big, soft, white hotel bath towels, I felt pure and sweet as a new baby. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard the knocking. I didn't pay any attention at first because the person knocking kept saying, Ellie, 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 let me in. And I didn't know any Ellie. Then another kind of knock sounded over the first, dull, bumping knock, a sharp tap-tap, and another, much crisper voice said, "Miss Greenwood, your friend wants you." And I knew it was Doreen. I felt angry with Doreen for waking me up. All I stood a chance of getting out of that sad night was a good sleep, and she had to wake me up and spoil it. "Ellie, Ellie, Ellie," the first voice mumbled, while the other voice went on hissing, "Miss Greenwood, Miss Greenwood, Miss Greenwood," as if I had a split personality or something. I opened the door and blinked out into the bright hall. Doreen was slumped against the door jamb. When I came out, she toppled into my arms. I couldn't see her face because her head was hanging down on her chest, and her stiff blonde hair fell from its dark roots like a hula fringe. I recognized the short, squat, mustached woman in the black uniform as a night maid who ironed day dresses and party frocks in a crowded cubicle on our floor. Seeing Doreen supported in my arms and silent except for a few wet hiccups, the woman strode away down the hall. "Let me lie down. Let me lie down," Doreen was muttering. I felt if I carried Doreen across the threshold into my room and helped her onto my bed, I would never get rid of her again. I decided the only thing to do was to dump her on the carpet and shut and lock my door and go back to bed. When Doreen woke up, she wouldn't remember what had happened and would think she must have passed out in front of my door while I slept, and she would get up of her own accord and go sensibly back to her room. I started to lower Doreen gently onto the green hall carpet, but she gave a low moan and pitched forward out of my arms. A jet of brown vomit flew from her mouth and spread in a large puddle at my feet. Suddenly, Doreen grew even heavier. Her head drooped forward into the puddle, the wisps of her blonde hair dabbling in it like tree roots in a bog, and I realized she was asleep. I made a decision about Doreen that night. I decided I would watch her and listen to what she said, but deep down, I would have nothing at all to do with her. When I woke up in the dull, sunless heat the next morning, I dressed and splashed my face with cold water and put on some lipstick and opened the door slowly. I think I still expected to see Doreen's body lying there in the pool of vomit like an ugly, concrete testimony to my own dirty nature. There was nobody in the hall. The carpet stretched from one end of the hall to the other, clean and eternally verdant except for a faint, irregular dark stain before my door, as if somebody had by accident spilled a glass of water there, but dabbed it dry again. This banquet is just a small sample of the hospitality our food testing kitchens here on Ladies' Day would like to offer in appreciation of your visit. A delicate, ladylike spatter of applause, and we all sat down at the enormous linen-draped table. There were 11 of us girls from the magazine, together with most of our supervising editors and the whole staff of the Ladies' Day food testing kitchens. There were only 11 of us, because Doreen was missing. Doreen was spending the day with Lenny Shepherd. She spent most of her free time with Lenny Shepherd now. While we were standing up behind our chairs listening to the welcome speech, I had bowed my head and secretly eyed the position of the bowls of caviar. One bowl was set strategically between me and Doreen's empty chair. I figured the girl across from me couldn't reach it because of the mountainous centerpiece of marzipan fruit, and Betsy, on my right, would be too nice to ask me to share it with her if I just kept it out of the way of my elbow by my bread and butter plate. Under cover of the clinking of water goblets and silverware and bone china, I paved my plate with chicken slices. Then I covered the chicken slices with caviar thickly, as if I were spreading peanut butter on a piece of bread. Then I picked up the chicken slices in my fingers one by one, rolled them so the caviar wouldn't ooze off, and ate them. When I finished my first plate of cold chicken and caviar, I laid out another. Then I tackled the avocado and crab meat salad. Avocados are my favorite fruit. Every Sunday, my grandfather used to bring me an avocado pear hidden at the bottom of his briefcase under 6 soiled shirts and the Sunday comics. He taught me how to eat avocados by melting grape jelly and French dressing together in a saucepan and filling the cup of the pear with the garnet sauce. I felt homesick for that sauce. The crab meat tasted bland in comparison. "How was the first show?" I asked Betsy when I was no longer worried about competition over my caviar. I scraped the last few salty black eggs from the dish with my soup spoon and licked it clean. "It was wonderful," Betsy smiled. "They showed us how to make an all-purpose neckerchief out of mink tails and a gold chain, the sort of chain you can get an exact copy of at Woolworth's for $1.98. And Hilda nipped down to the wholesale fur warehouses right afterwards and bought a bunch of mink tails at a big discount and dropped in at Woolworth's and then stitched the whole thing together coming up on the bus." I peered over at Hilda, who sat on the other side of Betsy. Sure enough, she was wearing an expensive-looking scarf of furry tails fastened on one side by a dangling gilt chain. I never really understood Hilda. She was 6 feet tall, with huge slanted green eyes and thick red lips and a vacant Slavic expression. I don't know if Hilda could read, but she made startling hats. She went to a special school for making hats in New York, and every day she wore a new hat to work, constructed by her own hands out of bits of straw or fur or ribbon or veiling in subtle, bizarre shades. "That's amazing," I said. "Amazing. Oh, I miss Doreen." She would have murmured some fine, scalding remark about Hilda's miraculous fur piece to cheer me up. I felt very low. I had been unmasked only that morning by J.C. herself, and I felt now that all the uncomfortable suspicions I had about myself were coming true, and I couldn't hide the truth much longer. After 19 years of running after good marks and prizes and grants of one sort and another, I was letting up, slowing down, dropping clean out of the race. When I made my wan entrance into the office at about 10 o'clock, J.C. stood up and came round her desk to shut the door, and I sat in the swivel chair in front of my typewriter table facing her, and she sat in the swivel chair behind her desk facing me. "Doesn't your work interest you, Esther?" "Oh, it does, I said. "It interests me very much." I felt like yelling the words as if that might make them more convincing, but I controlled myself. All my life I told myself studying and reading and writing and working like mad was what I wanted to do, and it actually seemed to be true. I did everything well enough and got all A's, and by the time I made it to college, nobody could stop me. I was a college correspondent for the Town Gazette, an editor of the literary magazine, and secretary of Honor Board, which deals with academic and social offenses and punishments. A popular office, and I had a well-known woman poet and professor on the faculty championing me for graduate school at the biggest universities in the East, and promises of full scholarships all the way. And now I was apprenticed to the best editor on any intellectual fashion magazine. And what did I do but balk and balk like a dull cart horse? I'm very interested in everything. The words fell with a hollow flatness onto J.C.'s desk like so many wooden nickels. "I'm glad of that," J.C. said a bit waspishly. "You can learn a lot in this month on the magazine, you know, if you just roll up your shirt cuffs. You have another year at college yet," J.C. went on a little more mildly. "What do you have in mind after you graduate?" What I always thought I had in mind was getting some big scholarship to graduate school or a grant to study all over Europe. And then I thought I'd be a professor and write books of poems, or write books of poems and be an editor of some sort. Usually I had these plans on the tip of my tongue. "I don't really know," I heard myself say. I felt a deep shock hearing myself say that, because the minute I said it, I knew it was true. When the cherubs in J.C.'s French wall clock waved their wings up and down and put their little gilt trumpets to their lips and pinged out 12 notes one after the other, J.C. told me I'd done enough work for the day and to go off to the Ladies' Day tour and banquet and to the film premiere, and she would see me bright and early tomorrow. Then she slipped a suit jacket over her lilac blouse, pinned a hat of imitation lilacs on top of her head, powdered her nose briefly, and adjusted her thick spectacles. She looked terrible, but very wise. As she left the office, she patted my shoulder with one lilac-gloved hand. Don't let the wicked city get you down. I dabbled my fingers in the bowl of warm water a Ladies' Day waitress set down in place of my 2 empty ice cream dishes. Then I wiped each finger carefully with my linen napkin, which was still quite clean. Then I folded the linen napkin and laid it between my lips and brought my lips down on it precisely. When I put the napkin back on the table, a fuzzy pink lip shape bloomed right in the middle of it like a tiny heart. I thought what a long way I had come. The first time I saw a finger bowl was at the home of my benefactress. I had the scholarship of Philomena Guinea, a wealthy novelist who went to my college in the early 1900s and had her first novel made into a silent film with Bette Davis, as well as a radio serial that was still running. And it turned out she was alive and lived in a large mansion not far from my grandfather's country club. So I wrote Philomena Guinea a long letter in coal-black ink on gray paper with the name of the college embossed on it in red. I wrote what the leaves looked like in autumn when I bicycled out into the hills, and how all knowledge was opening up before me, and perhaps one day I would be able to write great books the way she did. I'd read one of Mrs. Guinea's books in the town library. The college library didn't stock them, for some reason. And it was crammed from beginning to end with long, suspenseful questions. Would Evelyn discern that Gladys knew Roger in her past? Wondered Hector feverishly. And how could Donald marry her when he learned of the child Elsie, hidden away with Mrs. Rollmop on the secluded country farm? Griselda demanded of her bleak, moonlit pillow. These books earned Philomena Guinea, who later told me she had been very stupid at college. Millions and millions of dollars. Mrs. Guinea answered my letter and invited me to lunch at her home. That was where I saw my first finger bowl. The water had a few cherry blossoms floating in it, and I thought it must be some clear sort of Japanese after-dinner soup, and ate every bit of it, including the crisp little blossoms. Mrs. Guinea never said anything, and it was only much later that I learned what I had done. The movie was very poor. It starred a nice blonde girl who looked like June Allison but was really somebody else, and a sexy black-haired girl who looked like Elizabeth Taylor but was also somebody else, and 2 big, broad-shouldered boneheads with names like Rick and Gil. It was a football romance, and it was in Technicolor. I hate Technicolor. Most of the action took place in the football stands, with the 2 girls waving and cheering in smart suits with orange chrysanthemums the size of cabbages on their laps, or in a ballroom where the girls swooped across the floor with their dates in dresses like something out of Gone with the Wind, and then sneaked off into the powder room to say nasty, intense things to each other. Finally, I could see the nice girl was going to end up with a nice football hero, and the sexy girl was going to end up with nobody. At about this point, I began to feel peculiar. I felt in terrible danger of puking. "I'm going back to the hotel," I whispered to Betsy through the half-dark. "Don't you feel good?" she whispered, barely moving her lips. "No," I said. "I feel like hell." "So do I. I'll come back with you." We slipped out of our seats and said, "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me," down the length of our row, while the people grumbled and hissed and shifted their rain boots and umbrellas to let us pass. And I stepped on as many feet as I could because it took my mind off this enormous desire to puke that was ballooning up in front of me so fast I couldn't see round it. We fell into one of those yellow checkered cabs, and by the time we reached the hotel, I had puked once and Betsy had puked twice. Each time one of us felt sick, she would lean over quietly as if she'd dropped something and was picking it up off the floor, and the other one would hum a little, and pretend to be looking out the window. The cab driver seemed to know what we were doing, even so. We didn't dare to wait to add up the fare. We stuffed a pile of silver into the cabbie's hand and dropped a couple of Kleenexes to cover the mess on the floor and ran in through the lobby and onto the empty elevator. Luckily for us, it was a quiet time of day. Betsy was sick again in the elevator, and I held her head, and then I was sick and she held mine. Usually, after a good puke, you feel better right away. We hugged each other and then said goodbye and went off to opposite ends of the hall to lie down in our rooms. There is nothing like puking with somebody to make you into old friends. But the minute I'd shut the door behind me and undressed and dragged myself onto the bed, I felt worse than ever. I felt I just had to go to the toilet. I struggled into my white bathrobe with the blue cornflowers on it and staggered down to the bathroom. The next thing I had a view of was somebody's shoe. It was a stout shoe of cracked black leather and quite old, with tiny air holes in a scallop pattern over the toe and a dull polish, and it was pointed at me. It seemed to be placed on a hard green surface that was hurting my right cheekbone. I kept very still, waiting for a clue that would give me some notion of what to do. A little to the left of the shoe, I saw a vague heap of blue cornflowers on a white ground, and this made me want to cry. It was the sleeve of my own bathrobe I was looking at, and my left hand lay pale as a cod at the end of it. "She's all right now." The voice came from a cool, rational region far above my head. For a minute I didn't think there was anything strange about it, and then I thought it was strange. It was a man's voice, and no men were allowed to be in our hotel at any time of the night or day. "How many others are there?" the voice went on. I listened with interest. The floor seemed wonderfully solid. It was comforting to know I had fallen and could fall no farther. "Who are you?" I asked in a faint voice. "I'm the hotel nurse." "What's the matter with me?" "Poisoned," she said briefly. "Poisoned, the whole lot of you. I never seen anything like it. Sick here, sick there. Whatever have you young ladies been stuffing yourselves with?" "Is everybody else sick too?" I asked with some hope. "The whole of your lot," she affirmed with relish. "Sick as dogs and crying for ma." The room hovered around me with great gentleness, as if the chairs and the tables and the walls were withholding their weight out of sympathy for my sudden frailty. Somebody was standing by my pillow with a white cup. "Drink this and you'll feel better." A thick white china cup was lowered under my nose. My eyes moved tentatively to the skirt behind the cup. "Betsy," I said. "Betsy nothing. It's me." I raised my eyes then and saw Doreen's head silhouetted against the paling window, her blonde hair lit at the tips from behind like a halo of gold. Her face was in shadow, so I couldn't make out her expression, but I felt a sort of expert tenderness flowing from the ends of her fingers. I bent my head and took a sip of the broth. I thought my mouth must be made of sand. I took another sip and another until the cup was empty. I felt purged and holy and ready for a new life. Doreen set the cup on the windowsill and lowered herself into the armchair. "Well, you almost died," she said finally. "I guess it was all that caviar." "Caviar nothing. It was the crab meat. They did tests on it, and it was chock full of ptomaine. As soon as you all started keeling over like ninepins, somebody called into the office, and the office called across to Ladies' Day, and they did tests on everything left over from the big lunch. Ha!" "Ha!" I echoed hollowly. It was good to have Doreen back. "They sent presents," she added. "They're in a big carton out in the hall." "What are the presents?" I began to feel if it was a good enough present, I wouldn't mind about what happened, because I felt so pure as a result. Doreen went out into the hall. She came back carrying a thick book with a glossy cover and people's names printed all over it. The 30 best short stories of the year. She dropped the book in my lap. At 7 the next morning, the telephone rang. A man's voice said, "Is that Miss Esther Greenwood?" "It certainly is," I said. "This is Constantine something or other." I couldn't make out the last name, but it was full of S's and K's. Didn't know any Constantine, but I hadn't the heart to say so. Then I remembered Mrs. Willard and her simultaneous interpreter. "Of course," I cried, sitting up and clutching the phone to me with both hands. I'd never have given Mrs. Willard credit for introducing me to a man named Constantine. "Would you like to see the UN this afternoon? Maybe you would like a bite to eat afterwards." I detected the vocabulary of Mrs. Willard, and my heart sank. Mrs. Willard always invited you for a bite to eat. "Yes, I would like a bite to eat," I said stiffly. "What time will you come?" "I'll call for you in my car about 2. I let him hang up first, and then I hung up and lay back in the pillows, feeling grim. There I went again, building up a glamorous picture of a man who would love me passionately the minute he met me, and all out of a few prosy nothings. I tried to jack up my morale. Probably Mrs. Willard's simultaneous interpreter would be short and ugly, and I would come to look down on him in the end the way I looked down on Buddy Willard. Buddy Willard was a hypocrite. Of course, I didn't know he was a hypocrite at first. I thought he was the most wonderful boy I'd ever seen. I'd adored him from a distance for 5 years before he even looked at me. And then there was a beautiful time when I still adored him, and he started looking at me. And then just as he was looking at me more and more, I discovered quite by accident what an awful hypocrite he was. And now he wanted me to marry him, and I hated his guts. As I lay there in my white hotel bed feeling lonely and weak, I thought of Buddy Willard lying even lonelier and weaker than I was up at that sanatorium in the Adirondacks, and I felt like a heel of the worst sort. In his letters, Buddy kept telling me how he was reading poems by a poet who was also a doctor, and how he'd found out about some famous dead Russian short story writer who had been a doctor too. So maybe doctors and writers could get along fine after all. Now this was a very different tune from what Buddy Willard had been singing all the 2 years we were getting to know each other. I remember the day he smiled at me and said, "Do you know what a poem is, Esther?" "No, what?" I said. "A piece of dust." And he looked so proud of having thought of this that I just stared at his blonde hair and his blue eyes and his white teeth and said, "I guess so." Now, lying on my back in bed, I imagined Buddy saying, "Do you know what a poem is, Esther?" "No, what?" I would say. "A piece of dust." Then just as he was smiling and starting to look proud, I would say, "So are the cadavers you cut up. So are the people you think you're curing. They're dust as dust as dust. I reckon a good poem lasts a whole lot longer than 100 of those people put together." And of course Buddy wouldn't have an answer to that, because what I said was true. People were made of nothing so much as dust, and I couldn't see that doctoring all that dust was a bit better than writing poems people would remember and repeat to themselves when they were unhappy or sick and couldn't sleep. My trouble was I took everything Buddy Willard told me as the honest-to-God truth. I remember the first night he kissed me. It was after the Yale Junior Prom. It was strange the way Buddy had invited me to that prom. He popped into my house out of the blue one Christmas vacation, wearing a thick white turtleneck sweater and looking so handsome I could hardly stop staring, and said, "I might drop over to see you at college someday, all right?" I was flabbergasted. After this visit, I didn't hear a word from Buddy until one fine Saturday morning in early March. I was up in my room at college when the hall phone rang. "Is that you, Esther?" the girl on watch downstairs said, and when I said yes, she said, There's a man to see you. I was surprised to hear this. Because of all the blind dates I'd had that year, not one called me up again for a second date. I just didn't have any luck. I hated coming downstairs sweaty-handed and curious every Saturday night, and having some senior introduce me to her aunt's best friend's son, and finding some pale, mushroomy fellow with protruding ears